Normalized Strength of Schedule by Austin Lee is one of the best DFS research tools found anywhere to help analyze true offensive and defensive performance. But because Normalized SOS is just as useful, if not more so, for season-long research as it is for DFS, you won't find it on our DFS landing page. To open the chart from the Footballguys.com homepage, click on the In-Season page for the current week and scroll down to Statistics, where you'll see the Normalized SOS link. Normalized Strength of Schedule might appear a little intimidating at first, but once you get a handle on using the filters, it couldn't be easier to use. Austin gives a description of each data point right at the top of the page each week, so you can always reference it until you get comfortable. And from there, it's just a matter of filtering the data you want to analyze. By default, the filters are set to view offensive stat categories for the rest of the season according to strength of schedule. But for DFS purposes, the rest of the season obviously isn't our concern. We're only worried about the matchups for the current week, so I find it most useful to view the season-to-date data, which shows how each team has performed up to this point, and then use that information to help figure out which players might be going overlooked this week, even though they're in great spots. So let's say I want to see which quarterbacks truly have the best matchups this week. I would change the team filter from offense to defense, and you can see the filter I have selected appears in red. Now I get to choose whether I want to look at stat categories or fantasy points. Both are extremely useful to help project what could happen going forward, but I'll start out by looking at positional fantasy points. Then I'll change my time frame to year to date, though as the season progresses you may want to use a more recent window and look only at the last 5 games. And finally we have data type. Because I chose positional fantasy points, if I select raw averages, I'll be shown raw fantasy points per game allowed for each team, and of course all data types are sorted by position and heat mapped. The more green each cell gets, the better it is if you're looking at team offenses, but green for a defense like we're looking at here means they're a matchup we probably want to target. Production percentages will show the average percentage of fantasy points that each team has allowed compared to other teams that have faced the same opponents. Strength of schedule shows the average percentages that teams' opponents have allowed compared to other teams facing those same opponents. And then we have what to me is the star of the show, which is the normalized data that adjusts the fantasy points to reflect each team's true defensive performance. You can sort each column from low to high by clicking on the column header. So we could see Denver has been the worst schedule-adjusted matchup for opposing quarterbacks, and Detroit has been the best. If you want to know where the biggest discrepancies lie between raw fantasy points allowed and normalized fantasy points allowed, just click on Difference and sort the column again. So we can see here, once fantasy points allowed is normalized, Pittsburgh allows 2.7 more points per game to quarterbacks over their raw fantasy points per game average, which is substantially larger than any other team. If we dig a little deeper and look at the game log dominator, we could see the Steelers allowed 329 yards to Kirk Cousins in Week 1, 368 to Andy Dalton in Week 2, 301 and 2 TDs to Carson Wentz, 287 and 2 TDs to Alex Smith, and they couldn't force mistakes from mistake-prone quarterbacks Ryan Fitzpatrick and Ryan Tannehill in their last 2 games. Judging by those results, it's pretty clear we could trust Austin's formula to interpret the game logs for us, summarize them, and save us from having to spend quite so much time digging through them. If I change positional fantasy points to stat categories, now I can see each category that contributes to fantasy points. And when I sort them, Pittsburgh is at the top of the list in normalized pass attempts, completions, and pass yards allowed per game. It looks like it's been a lack of passing touchdowns that's keeping the Steelers' raw fantasy point per game average in the middle of the pack, but you have to wonder how much longer that can last when teams are throwing so much and piling up so many yards against them. Now, you probably didn't need normalized SOS to tell you Tom Brady was a great play against Pittsburgh this week. He's the most expensive quarterback across the DFS industry and likely to be the top-ranked QB on most tout sites. But what we're after in GPPs is outlier performances, 30-plus point games from quarterbacks that make it tough for entrants who fade them to make up ground on you. Brady will be a popular play this week for sure, but since quarterback ownership is usually pretty flat due to a surplus of viable options, and Brady's price is tough to fit under the cap, I'm not expecting him to exceed 15% ownership in tournaments, which would be fine. Based on the normalized SOS data, I'm confident Brady would reach tournament value more than 15 times if this game were played 100 times, which makes him a worthy tournament play, regardless of his ownership.